The Crusades have been a controversial point throughout much of history. And folk, I want to remind you something about history. A lot of times, generations later, will not feel as the people living at that time felt. And we have a difficult time understanding. Now, for a time in our history, the Crusades appeared to be the most wasteful, idiotic thing that Europeans did. However, in view of recent events, I think I can better understand. I mean, I took 2 courses on the Crusades in graduate school because we had a professor there who was an expert on one of the top 5 Crusade experts in the world. He wrote some articles even with the Encyclopedia Britannica. He did not like the Crusades, did not agree with them. But I have to say, at this point, I do. Here's why. Up until the time of the Crusades, Europe had been sitting here waiting for the Islamic people to come to them. The Crusades was where Europeans got up and took the offensive and carried the fight into their territory and spared them at home. Basically, where Europe, basically you take up the ball and start running rather than just simply staying on the defensive all the time, which guarantees you'll never win the game. You take the ball and take it to the enemy territory. Now, in our own history, one of the reasons the South lost Civil War was most of the battles occurred in the South. Robert E. Lee said that doesn't seem fair, so he twice tried to carry the fight into Northern Territory, and it was a big mistake both times. He went into Maryland and lost Antietam, then he went to Gettysburg, and that was a big, big blow to the Confederacy, the loss there. But in this case, the Crusades were simply Europe's attempt to take the fight into enemy territory. Now, folk, your authors here, I really have to say, I think they make a big mistake. Of course, they first wrote this some 14 years ago. One of the reasons that the Europeans gave the Crusades, Europeans were trying to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land once during their lifetime. And a lot of us still do. I mean, tourism is still a big industry. But they would come back complaining they were robbed by Muslims, by what they called the Saracens, that they were robbed. And in fact, I think that a lot of them were. Here's why. Because Europeans eventually got armies and told their pilgrims, you ride along with this army and we'll guarantee you a safe passage, for a fee we'll guarantee you a safe passage to the Holy Land. So Europeans began to be escorted by armies, and again, they would never have paid for an army if they hadn't felt that they were threatened. But today, I mean, historians will say, oh, there's no evidence that Muslims ever robbed European pilgrims, and folk, in view of what I understand about these people then and now, I have to say I think your authors were wrong. Nevertheless, when the emperor appealed to the Pope for aid, the Pope began to call for a crusade. He promised forgiveness for sins. He told prisoners, except for maybe the absolute worst of offenders, I'll let you out of prison if you'll promise to go on a crusade, and many thousands of them did. There was a promise of a happy afterlife and all this, a promise of forgiveness for all crimes and all sins if they would rise up and go on a crusade. Now, the Crusades lasted for about 200 years, 195 to be more exact. Lasted from 1095, when the first one was called, until 1290, when the last one was called. Now, at 1290, Europeans stopped, owing to the fact that in 1307 or 17 years later, the Black Death hit Europe, and if you know anything about armies, until recently, most of what killed soldiers or armies was pestilence and disease. You get a whole bunch of men together with lack of sanitary conditions in a camp, and pestilence would hit and just wipe out whole armies, much more so than battles. Well, when the Black Death hit Europe, Europeans decided among themselves, hey, we simply cannot go into Islam anymore. And of course, the Islamic people were also suffering from plagues. They couldn't go to Europe, so the Crusades ended at that point. Now, of the Crusades, there are about 200 events during this time known as Crusades, but there are 9 main ones. They're called the First Crusade, Second Crusade, etc., up until the Ninth Crusade. The only one that was a military success was the First Crusade. Now, let me state, I'm going to go into the Crusades in more detail later. When it comes to the chapter on European history, chapter 12, I believe, or it's maybe 13, we'll talk in more detail. But I'm just going to introduce you to them now. The first crusade took Jerusalem. It got Jerusalem. And it drove the Muslims out of what is today Israel. I mean, I say out of the Holy Land. The Crusaders set up a kingdom, and to this day there are two monarchs in Europe, the King of Spain for one, and maybe someone else in Europe has the title of King of Jerusalem that he supposedly inherited from the first Crusader to be crowned. The Crusades set up a kingdom of Jerusalem that lasted 100 years. Anyway, the first crusade was the only one of all the crusades that can be said to have been a military success for the Europeans. The second crusade did not gain any more territory, it didn't lose any either. But between the second and third crusade, a Muslim leader rose up named Saladin. Saladin was able to get the Muslims to forget their quarrels. Now here is one reason the Europeans initially had success. The Muslim world was in a state of disarray and they were fighting among themselves. They were not ready for an invading army to come in. The second crusade didn't find it better, but finally Islam got what it really needed, a charismatic leader, a strong leader, who united a lot of them, not all of them, but united a lot of them. Saladin was able to drive the Crusaders out of the Holy Land. Now, Saladin has made news in modern times. An Iraqi ruler named Saddam Hussein claimed that he was the reincarnation first of Nebuchadnezzar and then of Saladin. He liked both men because Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem. Saladin conquered Jerusalem. And guess what? Saddam Hussein didn't. But nevertheless, Saddam Hussein brought Saladin back into memory again by claiming, and he claimed that he looked like Nebuchadnezzar. Now I can't see the resemblance. I mean, I've seen pictures of Nebuchadnezzar we find on a few coins that are still around, but I don't see the resemblance. He claimed he looked like Nebuchadnezzar, and he claimed he looked like Saladin, and quite honestly, I don't know what Saladin looked like. But anyway, Saladin drove them out of Jerusalem, so Europe called the Third Crusade. The Third Crusade featured the strongest army that Europe had gathered to go fight them, but it had a problem. It had three kings. The King of England, King Richard the Lionhearted, the King of France, I'll call his name out next when we come to it next, and the Emperor of Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor. And these three powerful kings believed that they could drive Islam back out of the Holy Land. All right, the Holy Roman Emperor was trying to cross a river with a suit of heavy armor. He slipped and was drowned under the weight of his armor. So much for the Holy Roman Emperor's army. They went back home. The King of France never made it Holy Land. He decided, oh, I'm needed back in France. He turned around and he went home. That left Richard the Lionhearted with his army to fight Saladin by himself, and Richard fought well, fought bravely. There's been many a book written about Richard the Lionhearted fighting against Saladin and his host, but Richard was not a match for Saladin. So Richard finally went back home. He was in prison for a while here in Austria. Eventually he got released, and I don't know if he ever did find his way back to England. I don't know for sure. Eventually he was finally shot by a crossbow, and he died a few days later. Anyway, the Third Crusade was a flop. I won't go into any more detail about the rest of them this time. I will later. But what I want you to know, except for the First Crusade, all of the other crusades were military failures for the Europeans. But what they did show, they showed the Islamic world that Europeans can stand up and fight, and they showed the Islamic world again that they were not invincible. Islam was never able to conquer Europe. Anyway, the Crusades ended when the plagues hit. After a couple hundred years in the 1500s, late 1400s, Europeans began to travel around the globe. They had better cannon than the Islamic world, bigger ships, better navigation, better rifles, and eventually Europeans' technology got better and better and better. They wound up conquering almost all of Muslim territory and holding it for a few generations. Then came World Wars I and World War II, and Europeans wound up releasing all their hold they had on these countries. But almost every Muslim country wound up being conquered. The Muslims lagged far, far behind. In 1905, oil was discovered in Arabia, and then some Muslims at least got to be rich. Then the United States began sending its arms to these Muslim countries, and beginning around 1979 or so, the Islamic world started to reassert itself, and the rest will be the subject for another time. All right. Eventually, the Muslim world was able to take Constantinople. The Turks did. The Turks took Constantinople, and it began to threaten Europe from the east. But in the meantime, Spain spent 800 years driving the Muslims out. And as I mentioned, in 1492, they drove them out. In 1453, Constantinople fell and the Byzantine Empire was no more. Now, the older history books used to say 1453 was the dividing line between medieval history and modern. I mean, you had ancient history, medieval and modern. Two big things happened in 1453. Number one, the Byzantine Empire fell to the Turks. Number two, Britain and France ended this 100 Years' War without even making a treaty about it. They just simply stopped fighting. And then, of course, a whole lot was to happen in the next 100 years. After 1453, shortly thereafter, Columbus discovered America. A Portuguese sailor went around Africa. Then came the Reformation of Europe, the Protestant Reformation, and made a whole lot of changes to Europe. Then the Catholics had a Reformation, and thanks in part to the Reformation, Europe was able to burst out of its seams and go and expand over the whole globe. All this is a subject for a later time. And during this time, a lot of the Muslim world was left behind. This thing, a section about Andalusia on page 195, don't worry about it. Your book mentions how that Andalusia was an attempt for the Muslim world to assert itself, and it was short-lived. And folks, that's happened to them several times through history, and who knows, the present ISIS thing might be short-lived. I might get out in my car in about an hour and a half or two from now and find out that ISIS has been soundly defeated, but even though I doubt that would happen, but could happen. But some of these things that they've tried have been short-lived.